Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. So we're here to chat a bit about how to mitigate the effect of the inevitable future recession that will come about. And for this we have perhaps some of the most interesting people to hear chat about this. You guys were in the room when you were debating how to address the effects of the last one, and you've been thinking about this ever since. So questions that arose then: should the stimulus have been bigger? Was it politically naive to be as small as it was? Should it have been structured differently? Are questions that you guys have given a lot of thought of, and critically now at this moment when interest rates are near zero and the Federal Reserve is arguably out of ammunition, were another cyclical downturn to hit us. We're already 7 years into the recovery that we've got, and so maybe this prospect is not that far down the line. How should we prepare for this event? Is there anything that we should be doing now in terms of preparing, say, the fiscal toolkit? And I know later on Professor Blinder is going to be presenting a specific paper on how perhaps to think about a fiscal response. There is this critical question of how to address, the next downturn, and what are the tools that we have, and how can we reignite growth. But there's also another very important question that's also going to be talked about later today that I hope we can turn to now, is also about how to protect the most vulnerable when the next recession hits. And the experience that we've had of this one, to my mind, suggests that our social safety net really needs some redesigning. The last major redesign, which happened in the mid-1990s in an era of very robust economic growth and full employment, clearly did not serve a large chunk of the population when the employment situation turned sour. And so you see, and we will hear later today, about how the most disenfranchised were really left out of a lot, out of assistance, as it were. And the programs that we have missed too many. So in any event, I think let's start. I'd like to start with first asking a question for Sean, that you were, as I said, in the room when it went down. What can you tell us about what worked and what didn't work? That might, help us think going forward.
Yeah. So let me just start with a simple point, which is that it did work, and worked better than I think many people recognize, certainly in our popular reporting about it and our the average American's thinking. I think the Recovery Act, but also more broadly the response, were profoundly important. Whether you look at the 9 million job years that were preserved and created, whether you look at the nearly 10 points of cumulative GDP that were added, you're looking at overall a response that was quite powerful. Second, when you focus on the most vulnerable, the Recovery Act alone was, our estimates, about 4 to 5.5 million people who were saved from falling into poverty as a result of the recession. And I think oftentimes what we miss, we tend to focus on the Recovery Act. Was it big enough? Was it? There were 12 additional measures that were passed beyond the Recovery Act that took us to a total response that was about $1.4 trillion. And so, particularly as we look back and understand the political will to do something like this again, I think it's profoundly important that we have discussions like we are today, and that we help the American people understand that this set of policies, wherever we may argue around the edges, were profoundly important in avoiding another Great Depression. A second thing I would say in the debate about was it big enough, what could be different, we often talk about the Recovery Act again, could it have been bigger? The fact is that if you think about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, one of the most profound mistakes, I think, was Congress shifting toward austerity and a set of manufactured crises that hurt the economy. So if you look at the combination of sequestration and the government shutdown, you're looking at likely over 1 million jobs lost as a result. CEA's estimates, if you combine them, about a point of cumulative GDP lost. And it is enormously important, I think, that we learn those lessons, that shifting to austerity was a substantial mistake in the aftermath of the Great Recession. The third point I would just make, shifting a little more to the specifics of the conversation that we're having today, is that particularly at a time where the politics arguably are even harder to do what we did in the aftermath of the Great Recession, the automatic stabilization that can be provided in the safety net is even more important. And if you think about scale, automatic stabilizers roughly doubled the response. So from about 1.4 trillion to 2.8 trillion. So already enormously important in the overall response. But many, as you just laid out, were not as adapted as they should have been. And to be very specific, two, we think, important budget proposals we made this year were in unemployment insurance and also in TANF. In unemployment insurance, we need a system that has extended benefits built in much more automatically. And our proposal was that based on unemployment rate in states, that we allow up to 52 weeks automatically of extension of UI. But I think we also have a set of proposals that are forward-looking in terms of employment, in the ability to do job sharing, and also in terms of creating a system where we can set up wage insurance much more comprehensively across states. On TANF, and I'm sure this is going to be talked about later on today, but you have seen a dramatic decline in the share of population that's covered in states under TANF, and the share of limited funding that is actually going towards the most important core benefits. And so our proposal would both mandate a share of those benefits going to core services, create a fund that would be available, again, automatically to states that have higher unemployment rates, and third, starts to experiment with subsidized jobs in a way that I think is important for the longer run chances we have of recovering under a recession. So those are two specific areas where I think it's particularly important that we look at the safety net and its ability to be an automatic stabilizer in the next recession.
Great, thanks. Thanks. Larry, turning to you and perhaps turning more decidedly towards the future, how should we think about setting ourselves up for the next downturn? And if you would address kind of like the political limitations, as Sean mentioned right now, but the political situation is probably even worse, more difficult than it was then. Is that an impossible obstacle to surmount?
Let me first say that in general, I would agree with almost everything that Sean said. I thought Alan Blinder's paper on the macroeconomics of fiscal policy was incisive, and I largely agree with it. And while I'm less knowledgeable about it, the paper's assessing the countercyclicality of social insurance programs I would strongly associate myself with as well. First thing I want to say is actually to refer to something Roger said. Roger referred to periodic episodes of congressional dysfunction in American history, and he was right. I do not think we have had a comparable episode in at least the last century to demagogue Donald and the threat that he represents to the kind of reasoning that this panel is all about. And as important as the issues that we are discussing. I think stopping creeping, ignorant fascism from ascending to the White House is an issue that dwarfs all of that. With respect to the macroeconomics, I think Sean is right to take credit for the administration for preventing the depression that could have been. And it could have been something that looked like the 1930s. But I think it is a mistake. Somebody help me with this. I think it is a mistake to be too satisfied with where we have been. If you look at, never mind, I'll do without it. If we look at the period from 1929 to 1940 and what happened to GDP per adult American, and we look at the period from 2008 to 2019, as best we can judge it, it is equivalent. In other words, the 11 years after 1929 will have been no worse in terms of the end point to the 11 years that we have just been through. In that context, it is a mistake to be too satisfied with where we are. It is a mistake to distinguish too sharply between recovery, which is good, and recession, which is bad, which we are not in right now. The reality is that fiscal policy is going to be central for our economy over the next decade in a way that has not been the case since the Second World War. This looks at the data on cyclicality. A reasonable conclusion is that the odds are better than 50-50, a conservative conclusion, that we will have a recession within the next few years. Economists debate whether recoveries die of old age. Assume they don't. Then the conclusion is that there's between a 20 and 25% probability every year that they will go into recession in the next year. That makes it better than 50-50 for 3 years from within the next 3 years. What does the Fed normally do when that happens? The Fed normally cuts real interest rates by 5 percentage points. Is it conceivable that there's going to be room to do that, even allowing for QE, even recognizing that maybe rates could become negative 50 basis points? I submit that it's not, and I submit that people have been wrong about the Fed, as this picture shows, enormously consistently for the last 7 years. And so we are in a different world with respect to thinking about fiscal policy, both because of the growth problem the economy has now and because we don't have much in the tank with monetary policy for the next recession. Or to put the point differently, even leaving the question of the next recession aside, it is seriously questionable how well the economy will function with growth that is propelled by the financial activity that is generated by interest rates of just above 1%. And that's where markets are now saying interest rates will be 2 years from now on the path that we are on. And so changes in the fiscal monetary mix are essential, are the only tool available when the next recession comes, and I would submit that they are desirable right now. What are the crucial elements of changing the fiscal monetary mix? I would highlight 4. One, the only one I have a slide on, is a substantial increase in public investment. It is insane that federal investment in infrastructure net is now negative at a moment when interest rates have never been lower and 10-year real interest rates are essentially zero, and precious little good is happening at the state and local level either. Second, strong support for social insurance. When Keynes came to the United States in 1942, he pointed out that an important virtue of Social Security was that it could absorb the excess savings that would potentially hold back U.S. economic growth after the Second World War. Those considerations were not relevant in the succeeding 60 years, but they potentially are relevant in our current period of secular stagnation. Note that an expansion of pay-as-you-go Social Security does not raise the annual budget deficit, but in every economic model contributes to raising aggregate demand by enabling households to be able to look forward to more secure retirements. Third, there is a strong case for assuring that we are doing what we can to promote housing investment. We are managing this cycle in the worst way possible from the point of view of housing. We got all the people, all the lower middle income and poor people into their own houses when the price was going up and was a bubble. Then when the price plummeted, they all sold to private equity firms who rented the houses out at a 10% yield and earned tremendous capital gains. This is exactly the wrong moment for support for housing to be at a minimum rather than a maximum, and we should be doing much more to promote demand by promoting housing. And fourth, and related to my first point, this is the moment to be maintaining the infrastructure we have now. The one thing we know, if you look at airports, if you look at highways, if you look at the water system of Flint, Michigan, it is much more costly to defer maintenance than it is to do maintenance promptly. It is every bit as much a deficit that places a burden on my children's generation to defer maintenance as it is to issue paper debt. And I promise you that the costs compound far more rapidly with deferred maintenance than they do with the 13 basis points that represent the real interest cost of current long-term federal debt. Now, and with substantially more intensity when the next recession comes, maintenance, infrastructure investment, promotion of housing, and strengthening of people's confidence in Social Security, these are the priorities. Roger referred to our long-term fiscal picture. I am here to tell you that the most important determinant of our long-term fiscal picture is how successful we are in accelerating the economy's growth rate in the next 3 to 5 years, not the austerity measures that we implement. Anyone concerned with our long-term fiscal health should be redoubling their focus on the currently inadequate growth rate that leads us to have performed no better in the 11 years since the crisis than we did in the 11 years after 1929.
Well, and yet, let me kind of re-ask this. Next after the next election, we're likely to have a very similar House to the one that we have today. So how, I mean, say this is indispensable, but do we get it? Or are we just kind of like, is this disconnect between what we need and what we get going to persist?
Look, I'm an economist, not a politician, so I'm not going to forecast the politics. But I guess my observation about the politics would be that we need to move from a politics of either or to a politics of both and. I stress some of the things that I think are most important, but I actually think the argument that there are changes in the corporate tax code that would stimulate investment has some validity. I think the complaints about excessive regulation that hold back small and medium-sized business have some validity. So I think what we need to do, I think there are a whole set of issues around stimulating private investment that warrant attention as well. And so I think what we need to do in many ways is adopt the Democrats' ideas for promoting demand and some of the Republicans' ideas for promoting demand. Look, I believe passionately in more infrastructure investment, but the concerns that government doesn't do it so well, they're not stupid concerns. There's a bridge right outside my office. For those of you who've been there, it connects Harvard Square with Boston. The bridge is 232 feet long. It has been under repair with traffic blocked for 4.5 years. It took 11 months to build the bridge the first time. Julius Caesar built a 900-foot bridge over the Rhine in 9 days. Now, you can explain that in terms of a variety of environmental requirements. The Historical Commission had its say. The people who think that as part of strengthening infrastructure investment, we need to do something about those barriers, they're actually right. And so the answer to your question is that we need a strategy that moves beyond the shibboleths of both parties. There'll be a tendency in this room to emphasize the moving beyond the anti-government shibboleths, but there's also a need to recognize that government can function in a variety of ways better, and that there are a set of things that can be done to empower the private sector. I think that's actually right. And even if it was not completely right, I think if you ask what is the political strategy for causing something to happen, that is the political strategy for causing something to happen. You're not going to get a commitment to a public sector-led fiscal policy strategy without also having a strategy that is about recognizing that there are a set of issues about private sector activity and private sector investment.
Sean?
So first, let me say I was wondering as I walked up here where exactly the fire was in our fireside chat. Now it's been answered. So, and I'm happy to be sitting next to it. So, but I also, Larry's exactly right. I actually I drove across that bridge just last week and was wondering why it had been under construction. I thought maybe it had been rebuilt twice since the last time I saw it. But conversely, it is all, because I agree with Larry completely, and in fact, one of the things I love about my role is the M in OMB, which is the management piece of the work we do in government. And I think there is a trust deficit, in some ways more than there is a fiscal deficit in the country. On the other hand, it is incumbent upon all of us in this room, given the leanings that Larry has talked about, that when things do work, that we figure out how to tell the damn story about how they worked. And that is why I started with what I did, which is the fact that, by and large, the recovery worked. And Could it have been larger? Yes. Could it have done more? Was it perfect? No. But it did work. And you've told that story, right, as a journalist. But all of us, I think, have to figure out how to get beyond what is a particularly atomized media environment where it is always, I often say, the saying, no news is good news. Well, good news is no news, right? And how we get beyond telling the story when things are actually working, the Recovery Act, but more broadly, the work that we did at that time, we need to tell that story. And all of us need to figure out how to tell it better.
Of course, it's always the media's fault. So perhaps we could move to the element of social insurance that you mentioned a moment ago. And one of the criticisms that has been made of the system that we've had in place, TANF in particular, and, well, the combination of TANF and the Earned Income Tax Credit, was that it was so geared to work, to incent work and to reward work, that it really malfunctioned when there was no work to be had. And so the idea is there a case to be made? What's the case to be made to kind of like create a system that is less dependent on work? And there's an idea that's been making the rounds recently that has the support of even some people on the right, which is called the universal basic income, which totally dissociated from work. And I wonder, is there a case to be made for that, given, the reality we're in?
There's a case to be made for everything, but as a near-term and as a long-term response to a world where technology changes profoundly, maybe. As a relevant response to current problems in the current context, I think not. The core problem with a universal income is that how do you finance it? As Bob Greenstein was shrewdly pointing out at lunch, if you give $5,000 to everybody, that's $1.5 trillion. Now, the right-wing view of that is that you're going to get that money by cutting all the existing means-tested programs, which means that some of the poorest people around are only going to be getting $1,500 so that you and I can get our share of the universal income. I don't think that's a very good idea. If you try to finance it differently, then it gets extraordinarily expensive. The basic truth is that giving people benefits does influence their behavior, that there are a large number of people in our society, little children, people who are 75 years old, people who are disabled, who aren't going to work no matter what, and so you don't have to worry about the incentive effects, and it therefore makes sense to give them a lot more money than you can prudently afford to give to people where there are going to be large incentive effects. So I think that there are a variety of incremental reforms that would broaden eligibility for various existing programs that I would support, but I think that the universal basic income is one of those ideas that the longer you look at it, the less enthusiastic you become. My stepdaughter took time off from college and over the summer to work on her novel, and I thought that was a good thing for her to do. She would have qualified and would have automatically received the universal basic income. There are a large number of cases like that, and I think we got to be very careful in going in that direction.
So let me just add to that. I think one of the interesting opportunities we have right now as we think about our general reaction as a country to supports, and I think it's not just about those who aren't working. To Larry's point, it is a more narrow group of working age, able-bodied folks and their work and their access to the benefits. We have always, I think, been able to see in the research work that's been done the short-term incentive effects that Larry is talking about. What we haven't been able to see is the multi-decade impacts of those programs until recently with the advent of bigger data, really interesting work that's being done by folks like Raj Chetty and others, which is showing that literally over decades, you're seeing improvements of a third to a half in lifetime earnings from things like housing vouchers or others. So I do think it's important that we're able to relook at these and understand both the short-term costs that there may be and how to design around those, but also the enormously powerful difference in long-run effects. And I think, again, if we can do that research well and tell those stories well, I do think there's an opportunity to begin to reshape both the view of whether the safety net programs can have an impact on longer term, but also on the outcomes for people, but also, frankly, on costs. Because if you think of the costs of someone not working, if you think of all the attendant healthcare, criminal justice, and I could go down the list, impacts from those costs, the truth is that these investments may actually pay for themselves multiple times over if we design them well. And I think that is a change from what we have seen in prior decades, that research is beginning to tell us something that's quite powerful.
Yeah. Let me see one other thing. Alan Blinder will be able to talk more knowledgeably about this than I can. But if you ask what is a huge source of perverse procyclicality, it is state and local budgets. And it is the state and local safety net, which gets cut because there are more poor people and there's the same amount of money and there's less tax collection and you have to have a balanced budget every year. There's the state and local investment that gets cut. And what was the least popular part of the Recovery Act? The grants made to state and local governments, because as Ram colorfully explained to me, let me see if I understand this, Larry. You're saying that our big thing should be one government giving money to another government. And that's your idea of a popular policy. I said, my job's to say what the right policies are. Your job's to sell the policies, Ram. But there's a point there, and that is, and as we think about the right response, thinking about this federalist dimension on the safety net programs, because a lot of the safety net is state and local, thinking about it on the public investment, because a lot of the public, as you saw in my chart, most of the infrastructure investment is in fact state and local, and I think that is a crucial aspect that we devote too little attention to, in part because different people are different, I suppose, but when you say the words fiscal federalism, it's not something that makes most people's blood boil and draws a vast audience to your forum and all of that, but it is actually hugely important.
And you think we've got problems in our legislature, right?
Right.
Look at those state and local legislatures these days.
Yeah. So listen, it's time, I think, to open this up to questions from you guys. And here's one that I'm really interested in hearing. It's really, is there anything that we can expect still from the Federal Reserve in terms of unconventional policy? So rates are at zero. We're already QE'd out, but negative interest rates, as Europeans have tried. Having Janet Yellen put a lot of money into a jumbo jet and spreading it over the country. I mean, is there space still for really, more unconventional policy making? Could that have any traction?
My view, it's trying beats not trying as a strategy. And so I've written, no secret, that I think the risks on the slowdown, disinflation, deflation side dwarf those on the accelerating inflation, overheating economy side, and that insight needs to inform Fed policy going forward. I think there's a debate that reasonable people could have as to whether there's 50 basis points more of stimulus available, or counting in the effect of all the measures, or whether there's 150 basis points available. I don't see how anybody could make a case that there were 250 or 300 basis points available. And that means I don't see how anybody could make a case that there was nearly enough to respond to the next recession. I say that because if you think about the different tools, forward guidance, well, that lowers people's expectations of future rates, but people's expectations of future rates are already extraordinarily low. QE, well, that reduces term premiums. Well, term premiums are already extremely low. Negative rates, maybe, but negative 75 would be an extremely negative rate. And there's lots of reasons to think that the lower you get on rates, the lower the marginal impact is. And so going down probably encounters diminishing returns. Helicopter money. Hear me. Helicopter money is fiscal policy. There's no such thing as helicopter money that isn't fiscal policy. And by the way, in today's world, where the Fed pays interest on money, it's the same thing as fiscal policy, because a bit of reserves held at the Fed paying 0.25% interest rate is, or 0.5% interest rate, is precisely the same thing as floating rate government debt in terms of all of its economic impacts. So yes, I'm for it. I think it's distinctly suboptimal as stimulus, because I think monetary stimulus raises risks of bubbles, financial instability, encouraging leveraging, reaching for yield, and all of that. That's why I would prefer more expansionary fiscal and more contractionary monetary today. And that's why I think the principal tool has to be fiscal in the future. But yeah, you can get more out of monetary policy, but not lots more. And a significant part of what you get is beggar thy neighbor, because it works through exchange rates and to shift demand.
Okay. How should our thinking about this be how should we take into account this kind of like long-term prospect of extremely low growth? You know, I think that there's the cycle that's layered on top of it, but you're layering a cycle on growth that is 2% per year, perhaps less, due to long-term factors like aging population, low productivity growth, at least by the standards of the mid-20th century. How does this change your thoughts or affect the strategy, say?
If I could say, this is one of the particularly crazy things about not having done immigration policy. Too rarely does immigration come up in debates about our fiscal standing as a country. Mm-hmm. The fact is that the math is simple on our demographics, right? We are going from about 3.6 workers per retiree to, within the next decade, 2.4 workers per retiree. How do you solve that? More workers. And immigration is the single most important thing that we can do on that front. It's, over the next 20 years, $1 trillion in deficit reduction to do, if you just took the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill. So certainly one answer to that, and this is not a worldwide answer, this is a U.S. answer, is immigration reform.
Larry, do you want to hit it?
First, it's a big deal. And if you want to understand why Demagogue Donald is doing what he's doing, the dismal rate of growth that we've had and that appears to be in prospect has to be the single most important factor in the broad environment that's causing this to happen at this moment. Second, some of it's probably inevitable. There's demographic changes that aren't going to get changed quickly, though Sean's completely right about immigration reform. Some of it probably has to do with, I don't exactly agree with Bob Gordon on everything, but his basic point that you could sort of only invent the automobile once and you could only invent electricity once. And once you have those things, you sort of have them, and it's kind of hard to do something better. There's a basic truth in that as well. And I think the people who say we're not measuring a bunch of the productivity growth we have, I think those people have a good point too. But are we pursuing the things that would constitute a growth agenda? Whether it's immigration reform, whether it's family leave to support increased labor force participation, whether it's tax reform to motivate more investment to take place at home, whether it's regulatory policies that are devoted to spurring growth, whether it's building an adequate public investment infrastructure, we're not in a large and concerted way doing any of those things. And so I think that there's every reason to think that with an available program, we could raise the growth rate by 0.5% to 1% over the next 10 to 15 years. And that would do more for the national debt, for our national security, for our capacity as a nation to be generous to the poor than any other single thing. And so I think the failure of slow growth to have a central place in our politics, even on both sides of the debate, is alarming.
So we're almost there. I just would like to throw in one last question. It's kind of a bit of a provocative question here from the floor for Sean. And it says, what presidential policy proposal do you see as being the most detrimental to the economy?
Having just gotten a Hatch Act briefing from my general counsel in the last few weeks about not being able to comment on political campaigns, I'll turn that question over to Larry. Or I could take it back.
I think it's I think it's a. I don't actually. Yes, I mean Donald Trump's tax policies do not add up in a way that is hugely disproportionate to the way presidential candidates' tax policies frequently do not add up. Yes, the wall is kind of a ludicrous policy with respect to international economic engagement. But I actually think the biggest thing is not a policy proposal. It is the sense that every citizen and every business is going to be subject to arbitrary exercises of power by the executive branch. For the first time in my adult lifetime, I forget my adult lifetime, in my lifetime, and I would submit well before that, I think the kinds of concepts of political risk, repudiation of the debt because it's inconvenient, prosecution of newspapers that take undesirable positions. For the first time, the kind of political risk issues that multinational companies hire experts to assess when they think about an Argentina or a China are now real and live issues with respect to investment in the United States. And I think that's the greatest threat to our prosperity.
Well, yeah. Well, with that, we got to end it here. Thanks a lot. There's something coming up next.